Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the B2B Club, bringing industry-leading guests directly to you. The B2B Club takes a regular deep dive into topics ranging from marketing to marketplaces, personalization to payments, revenue to regulation, and so much more. If you want to be in the know about all things B2B e-commerce, start your listening journey with us today. My name is Lucy Heavens, and I am the VP of Marketing at Hakodo. So on today's episode, we're going to be focusing on how B2B e-commerce firms can build an award-winning marketing strategy. As a result of the pandemic, the world of B2B has gone through huge change. A number of businesses had to quickly pivot and move their offline in-person sales to online. And that trend is continuing. So 2 years ago, only 17% of sales were made from online purchases. And that number now is expected to reach 23% by 2025. So given these changes, it's now essential for the B2B firms to have an effective marketing strategy to help them to increase brand awareness and sales. So over the next 30 minutes or so, we are going to take a look at defining what a marketing strategy is, how to plan one and put one together, the key tactics that businesses can implement, as well as taking a look at some of the examples of best practice from industry leaders. So today I am joined by marketing expert Colin Lewis, who's also one of my personal heroes, who's a speaker and a consultant with over 25 years of experience in both B2B and B2C e-commerce and marketplaces. Colin has experience from across the globe, having worked in the UK, Australia, China, Japan, and Indonesia. Wow, for major international brands. So Colin, we touched a little bit on the intro there, but could you give us a quick overview of your career and the types of e-commerce businesses that you've worked for in the past?
Well, Lucy, thank you very much for inviting me on the podcast. That was a kind of a glowing intro, so hopefully I can do justice to that. So I've been marketer for 25 years with brands like 118 in the UK, big airlines like BMI, British Midland. But I've also worked for startups as well as these big brands. And I like to say, worked with zero budgets and budgets of $25 million. But for my sins in the startup world, very much so, about 20 years ago, I worked in a B2B e-commerce startup that we tried to get off the ground. So I am very familiar with the world of B2B e-commerce, but also e-commerce. I ran my first B2C e-commerce site in 2006, turning over 100 million. And I've been running, I'd say, 3 e-commerce sites, big sites since then. But my side hustle, I think is what people call it these days, has been I'm also a writer, and I've created 2 B2B e-commerce best practice reports, e-commerce best practice reports, as well as a best practice on marketplaces and on retail media as well. And I do a lot of teaching. I've been teaching e-commerce to postgraduate students and obviously mature students since 2011. So it's that kind of combination of writing, doing, and thinking that hopefully I will be able to help your audience to think through some of the challenges.
Amazing. It's fantastic. Thank you very much. So first of all, then, to kick off the discussion, I'd like to take a little bit of a step back. So I've been in the industry for a little while myself as well. And strategy just seems to be one of those words that people kind of throw around. And I've worked at firms where strategy or having like a set strategy is super important. And then I've worked for other firms where they're just like, look, let's just get down and get the job done. So in your view, what is a B2B marketing strategy? Like what should it include?
Well, this is a great question because it's quite hard to answer in many respects. And the reason it's hard to answer is there is so much verbiage, so many words talked about what is strategy, that we can kind of lose. We can't see the wood from the trees. And this kind of came to mind very much so for me it's been about 15 years ago when I did an MBA. We had a full whole section just purely on strategy. And it finally dawned on me why it was so difficult to do, because basically it means lots of different things to lots of different people. We would call it an abstraction in English, which means that it's like You can't touch it, you can't feel it. So as a result, everybody has different views on what it actually is. And for our audience, I would say, be careful what you're reading about strategy. And in most respects, what you read about strategy is not really strategy, it's tactics, as we shall see. And my first recommendation to the audience is you should buy a book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rummel, the professor in UCLA. And that is the clearest sort of indication of, or sorry, the clearest kind of laying out of how to think about strategy. Sure, there's lots of great books out there, but this is the one where it's a sort of on-ramp for you to really understand what it is. So that's my kind of opening gambit on strategy. And then what I would say to you is your next step is to say, what is strategy? And this is where we all get mixed up. Now, the strategy is like a sort of a coherent set of analysis and policies and ideas, and then actions that respond to a challenge. Now, that sounds very abstract, so we're going to get into that. Whereas most of what we do is kind of tactical. So let's say I'm working with Lucy, and Lucy says, Colin, what should we do next week? We should do content strategy. We should improve our AdWords strategy and so on. We're actually kind of lying to ourselves here, because they're actually tactics. They're a choice of channel or a choice of content or a context or whatever we're doing. They are actually tactics. And so we have to kind of understand the difference between strategy and tactics. And that's really what we're going to talk about on this podcast.
Okay. Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you. So, thinking then about that, I mean, where's if somebody is just starting with a blank sheet of paper, they've just started in a brand new position, maybe a startup, like you said, where do they start in kind of putting together a marketing strategy?
That's a good point, actually, on the difference between strategy in an existing business that has sort of existing sales, marketing pipeline, and that in a startup. I'm lucky enough to be asked to advise a lot of startups as one of my other side hustles. And in fact, as recently as yesterday, I was spending 2 hours talking about positioning and go-to-market strategy for a really interesting sustainability startup. So let's just kind of roll back here for a second. One of the things, the way to think about this is we talk about strategy, but most of the time we're talking about tactics, as I just said. And you can recognize this by questions that we might ask ourselves or our boss might ask ourselves, which is like, what's the thing we need to do now? What's the thing we need to do? And what we need to do is recognize that and say, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just they're tactical questions. Whereas really what we want to start off with is this idea of diagnosis. And so the marketing kind of strategy or way to think about strategy, I call it out in 7 steps. So there's the where, which is we need to diagnose the challenge first. What's going on? What do we want? Well, then we have to make a set of clear choices that define what we're going to do. Who we're going to target, what customer segment we're going to target. What do we stand for? What's our positioning? And then, of course, product and proposition. What are we selling? And then there's activation and execution. What do we think we can do and what we actually do? So activation and execution. So, for a load of good reasons, activation and execution is where we spend a lot of our time. But actually, I really, really, really recommend everybody starts with diagnosis starting off. Now, why do I say that? Well, diagnosis is part of the problem. It's what I find is there's not enough work done on diagnosis, and I'm including myself as one of the sinners here because I like to leap to action here. But diagnosis will save you a ton of time later when you get to activation and execution. I would say when I deal, whether it's with startups or whether it's with existing businesses or mistakes I've made in the past, I would say the problem is always upstream of activation. Now, what I mean when I say that is I've devised a one-page marketing plan that's very easy to follow, and it works from top to bottom, and it's just a series of boxes that you follow. And I like to call the upstream problem of activation, when your activation and execution doesn't work, is that you haven't gone through your diagnosis and your strategy in the first place. So let's just kind of get into this kind of, what are we talking about here? So diagnosis is a proper examination of all the market and the issues that are facing the business. And I like to kind of break it out in terms of, to explain diagnosis to people, is that if we talk about things outside of marketing, one of the big issues that people are talking about, obviously, right now is the environment and sustainability. And you'll see much of the diagnosis to the climate challenges that are out there they're focusing on the symbol of the thing rather than the thing. So, for instance, you will see a lot of people say, bad things are happening because we are going to, there's too many cars and there's too much pollution. But that's not the diagnosis of the problem. The diagnosis of the problem is that the cities have been built without decent public transport. That's actually the problem. So we end up having to have cars, or that it's too far to our place of work to get to by public transport. So therefore we have to drive our car. But you will see people focus on the car, but actually the issue is the public transport issue. So that's a very simple, albeit contentious, discussion of how you can say, well, the diagnosis isn't really that correct. So we have to spend and be very harsh with ourselves. And let me give you an example in a B2B marketing environment. I used to be this sort of person who would say, I know all the issues, and there's a little bit of ego kicking in there when you say that. And I'm saying, right, this is what our marketing plan is for the year. Sure, I might do a bit of market analysis and a bit of tokenism. But actually, in my last big B2B marketing role a couple of years ago, I got into the discipline of getting all my sales folks in the room individually, and the commercial directors in the room individually, not together. And I would go and put up the plan on the wall and say, this is what we did last year. These are the results. What do you think our problems are? What would you like to see? And it was bruising and it was uncomfortable, but I unpacked things that were in their mind and unpacked things that were in the market that I had to go and say, you know what? I didn't know that beforehand. My diagnosis would have been incorrect, and I would have been blindly wandering out into the future. So the first kind of thing I would say is be realistic with yourself and your diagnosis. Don't bring your ego to the table, but also watch for other people's misdiagnosis of any situation, because most times they're symptoms rather than the actual problem itself.
That's really interesting. Like it reminds me of being back in school, when you did the fractions and you had to kind of break them down to the lowest common denominator. It's that kind of effect, isn't it? Where you have this great big fraction and you just have to, no, you can break it down more. You can break it down more.
It's true. In fact, one of the things to show you where my mentality is, I used to always do when we're doing the theorems. They'd say, you have to prove the parallel lines in a parallelogram are the same, and I would just go, why bother with that? Look, they're the same. I could just see them on the screen. Yeah. So that is the sort of person I am. I'm straight to conclusion, and it's one of the things as well as we marketers listening to this podcast is, you're going to do two errors on, you're going to have one error that's your error, and the other one is other people's errors, is they don't really understand diagnosis. It can be hard to explain to them. So you can't be kidding yourself. However, we all kid ourselves because, as Bob Hoffman of the Ad Contrarian says, relying on one's own behaviors and tastes is narcissism disguised as strategy. Ooh. And I like to go and say, your opinion is totally irrelevant. And so that's another diagnosis point. I like, I'm terrible at this because I used to always go and say, well, I do this, and it's good in a certain sense, which is like you can see yourself as having maybe some competence in a certain level, but actually, annoyingly enough for you and me, Lucy, we are not representatives of the human race. We do not actually know everything that's happening in the world. We are not omniscient, and sad to say, we actually, other people's opinions do matter and their views do matter. So we actually have to take out, and you'll notice this because I do this, see this in a lot of my classes, which is, Lucy and I are talking, and I'm maybe talking about some topic, and then somebody says in the class, well, here's what I do. I'd never do that because X. And you're like, yeah, so what? Like, and people get kind of really shirty because it's this breaking out of one's own ego and breaking out of one's own perceptions is very, very hard to do. And the final point on diagnosis is our love of new stuff. I spent an hour on a call with somebody yesterday where they were talking about the metaverse. And I'm objective on the metaverse. I don't really mind either way. Yeah. It's not something I control. There's no levers. I'm not Mark Zuckerberg. So I don't have any opinion on it. But these guys had strong opinions. And I was like, well, nobody's buying anything here. Nothing's happening. You're just focused on a love of new stuff. So that's diagnosis. That's diagnosis.
Talk about all of that stuff, but sometimes you just you have to kind of solve the boring problems first, don't you?
Yeah, exactly.
Majority of the time. But I mean, this is it's definitely sometimes I think, especially if you are in kind of a new role or you're just starting kind of a new marketplace, it's just taking that kind of step back to basics, isn't it? And asking yourself those questions. That's kind of the diagnosis part, which I think is super important. When it does come to kind of the tactics, then we've done our diagnosis, we know kind of, and we've done the kind of the messaging part as well. When we do get down to tactics, there's so many tactics, so many things that we can do. And I think, if we are either a small team or if you are kind of a startup marketplace, how do you prioritize, how do you know kind of what tactics to kind of apply, even with that diagnosis? And obviously, the same goes for kind of budget on that. It's the time and budget. Where do we spend our time and where do we spend the budget when we've got, when we are a limited kind of startup?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's two kind of points I want to make on this before I get into the detail. So having worked in numerous startups, what I've found, and our audience, I'm sure, is familiar with this, is that typically senior management doesn't understand marketing. And that's okay. It's just you've got to be wary of that. I'm reminded of the second page of the definitive book on technology marketing called Crossing the Chasm by the recently deceased Geoffrey Moore. And on page 2, there's an absolutely on point statement where he says, in a startup environment, the senior management go and say, we particularly say when the numbers haven't come in for the first year or two, and there's this line that says, say if we're selling databases, Oracle's getting their marketing better, and Sybase has done better, and blah blah blah. They've all outmarketed us. And he says, with unerring accuracy, all heads at the table turn around to face the vice president of marketing, and hanging's too good for them. Let's get rid of them straight away. Now, that little sort of vignette is basically what happens is in a startup environment is what we need to think about is the fact that as marketers, our role is a very serious responsibility. You and the salesperson have a very serious responsibility, which is the growth of the firm. And you have to really, therefore, be very disciplined and rigorous. And I'm going to give you some tips on that later in the podcast. But it's not some random thing where you can run around coming up with ideas. And in fact, before I get into the tactics, there is a gentleman called Steve Blank, and he's got a great URL called steveblank.com. And he's written some of the definitive books on startups and definitive thinking on startups. But the phrase that really rings to mind, and it's a great phrase, which is, a startup is an organization that comes together in search of a business model. A startup is an organization that comes together in search of a business model. And what happens is, and this is where our tactics become quite challenging, because tactics and channels we choose and content we do typically are when the product market fit or everything is very defined. And what we need with our management is to get a sort of tacit, implicit, or actual agreement that everybody knows that we are a business in search of a repeatable, scalable business model. And until we have a repeatable, scalable business model, all marketing tactics are up in the air and up for grabs because they're all testing, because they're dependent on product, they're dependent on pricing, depending on a whole lot of other things. So be very aware of that. So you need to check out Steve Blank and search out this phrase, which is a startup is an organization, or he uses the word entity, that comes together to find a scalable, repeatable business model. And your management need to know that, because it's a different thing to have a business that has product market fit and it doesn't have product market fit, because your tactics then are completely different.
I was talking to somebody about this the other day about product market fit, and I think there's this this view that a little bit like the career ladder, everybody kind of thinks there is a career ladder that you go through, and you climb up and you go from being a junior to a kind of a senior and and then a manager and a director, and it's never like that. We always refer to the kind of career as a squiggly line or a squiggly path instead of a career ladder. And I think with product market fit, it's the same thing. I think there's this general view that, in this perfect world, you find product market fit and then kind of growth happens from there and everything, the world is perfect. But you've probably had this in the number of startups that you've worked for. And I've certainly seen it. It doesn't happen like that. It is a bit like the squiggly career path. It's a squiggly line. You think you have product market fit and everything seems to be going fine, and then suddenly there's a little bit of a curveball and you realize you've been building a product actually that's for quite a niche or limited market, and then you have to diversify, and your product market fit, you go off on that journey again, but that's fine. It's
a great point. Again, like I say, it's not as though I'm some sort of saint who's blessing the masses here. I'm that person. I'm like, hey, we got a customer. Whee! Everything's amazing. And as I say, the frame of reference, our mindset in a startup has to be very different to if you've worked in a kind of mature business. And in fact, any of you who are moving from mature businesses to to startups, what I want you to do is be like that scene in the Men in Black movie where he shines a light into their eyes and it raises their memory, because almost everything you've learned is completely irrelevant. Now, this is really hard to take. I'd worked for a company called Thomas Cook for 8 years. I'd been all over the world with them. I was, went on a rocket with a career. Then I joined a startup. And luckily, I had some level of self-awareness, even though I was a good bit younger, which was like, okay, turns out that everything I know is not relevant. I've got to learn something new. And my colleagues who faltered were those who said, well, where's the brand campaign? Where's this? And I had enough flexibility of mind, not because I'm a great person, but it's just like I'd had a few knocks earlier in my career. So I was very much flexible of mind. And I also had a little bit of self-awareness, which is everything that you bring from your past into the current organization can be useful, but it also could be useless. Whereas most people, and we're all familiar with these people, say, well, when I was at Oracle, here's what we did. When I was at Microsoft, here's what we did. And the ideal answer is you get a big club and start beating them up and saying, I don't care what you did at Microsoft or Oracle, but that's not allowed in the workplace. So the best thing to do is go and say, hey, that's not really quite that relevant because we're in a startup, and a startup is an organization that comes together in search of a repeatable, scalable business model. But by the way, on this one here, there's another little trap. This is part 2 of what I was going to say, aside from the comment about Steve Blank. And again, this is really important for us to get our heads around. So you'll hear a lot of people talk about business plans and all the rest of it. Business plans are kind of irrelevant. They're like the bus timetable in London. They're not that connected with reality. They're just a document of intent and direction of travel. And having had to put together numerous startup business plans, I would always sort of like cry like a 2-year-old, screaming and roaring, going, this is a waste of time. I am not putting together some phantom numbers that I've essentially pulled out of thin air. Or I didn't use language as nice as that. I would say pulled out of my ass just to make it work for a venture capitalist. So business strategy is how you intend to make money using the assets that you have. So that's a business strategy. And everything else is in service of that. And marketers, we tend to love marketing as our thing, but it's not the only thing. The business strategy is what we're in service of. The next step in that sort of mini hierarchy is marketing strategy, which is, how we plan to reach, acquire, convert, and engage our customers. So that's the marketing strategy, which is what we're talking about. Brand strategy is what the brand should represent to those customers, and it's a subset of marketing strategy. And then creative strategy is what the proposition is, what's the content, what's the tone and the messaging. And we need to be very rigid with ourselves on that hierarchy, because if you are a sad person like me who spends a bit of time on marketing Twitter and various other Twitter forums on marketing, you will think that brand strategy is literally the be all and end all. And in a startup, it ain't. What matters is product market fit, and creative strategy kind of doesn't matter either. What I would call good enough design, good enough user experience is all you need. Marketing strategy is where we're at. Okay, with all that in mind, let's look at what I call activation and execution. So activation is obviously the act of thinking through what channels we're going to use, what content we're going to use, and what's the context. So did you see I used 3 C's there? In our activation plans, it's channel choice, content choice, and context choice, as in how we can get in front of them. And then we get into the execution piece of saying we're going to do it. Now, of course, everything I've talked about, I'd say 70% of our time is in the world of activation and execution. Whereas in our world of diagnosis and strategy is not something that's done every week. However, that's true if we're working in a company that has got continuous demand and we understand where we're at. In other words, has product market fit, is out there in the market. And so my second big thing, aside from, in terms of self-awareness, aside from the fact that your opinion is not relevant, the other bit of self-awareness is that our activation and execution in marketing in a startup, we need not to be in love with our plans. We need to have enough flexibility in mind to say, that was good then, and now I'm going to throw it out, which can be heartbreaking, and many a tear has been shed by me in that context, because the thing I was in love with, that I kind of buffed to the edges and executed with heart and soul, now doesn't appear to work, and I need to throw it out, or the circumstances have changed, or our money has run out, or whatever. Yeah. So one has to have this level of insight to say that incredible content plan with a beautiful piece of work that I put together, I'm now jettisoning it. And that's pretty hard to do. I find that incredibly hard to do. So with that in mind, what are the sort of content and strategy things that I like to think of? Well, as you said at the outset, Lucy, the world of B2B marketing has changed. It used to be the golf days and the events, and now everything is online. And I start off with one very simple thing, is the creation of a customer journey or a customer funnel. You will read a lot of people saying the customer funnel is dead. The customer funnel has collapsed, blah, 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 blah. And that may be all true, but you got to start somewhere, and you got to go and say, what are standard journeys that customers go on? You can do one that I use, which is awareness, familiarity, in market, purchase, loyalty, that sort of order. So awareness, and this is a upside down triangle: awareness, familiarity, in market, purchase, loyalty. Or you can be lazy and just have acquisition, conversion, retention. I don't care what you do. But at each level, what's happening is, what we want to do is talk maybe a little bit about creating people knowledge that the brand is there, and what it does. I'll talk about that in a second a bit more. Then we want to engage people with what we're doing, and then we want to get them to act. This is obviously very much what the B2B SaaS folks do in great detail. Now, I did mention the word brand awareness. In a startup, point number 3, talked about self-awareness. You do not want to develop a brand. Okay, that sounds like shocking behavior I've just announced there. But you're not in the business in brands, in startups, of developing a brand. You're in the business of customer acquisition. You're in the business of product market fit. You're in the business of getting a repeatable, scalable business model. You are not in the business of brand development. And I'm sure a car will pull up, or a SWAT team will run through the window here, take me out, and burn me at the funeral pyre for saying that. But I don't care, because the people who tell you alternative to that have never worked in a startup.
Yeah,
Yeah. I'm
absolutely.
sure that's your experience as well, Liz.
It's totally my experience. Yeah, it's always, and it's really interesting, going back to what you were saying about, you know, no disrespect, but not a lot. Sometimes you find that some of the senior management teams sort of, don't really sort of understand marketing, and it's always the first thing, isn't it? We need to build a brand. We need to, get our brand out there and our name out there. We want to be famous, but yeah.
But it's I want to be famous. I want to have a head full of hair, be 6'4", and look like Brad Pitt. There's a lot of things I want in life, but that's actually not reality. Yeah. So simple funnel. Top of funnel, if you want to call it, you've got prospects. Middle of funnel is you've qualified those prospects, and then bottom of the funnel, they're shortlisted, and you're hoping to try and close them. Make it a very, very simple funnel. And then what you want to do is say, what are the tactics that are going to be associated with tofu, mofu, bofu, top of funnel, middle of funnel, and bottom funnel? Now, what we're doing here today, a podcast, it is a slightly sort of meta statement I'm going to make. What we're doing today, I'm asking the question to the audience: what part of the funnel do you think running a podcast is? If you ran a podcast in your business, I'll give you 2 seconds to think about that. What part of the funnel, tofu, mofu, bofu, targeting prospects, targeting qualified, and targeting your shortlisted to get them to convert? What do you think podcast is? So I'll put you out of your misery. A podcast is a sort of brand awareness business. So it's more getting the prospects further down the funnel, getting interested in understanding. It's about credibility creation. However, podcasts are also excellent in terms of getting people involved and thinking through the brand and understanding it. I've actually got personal experience of this. When I speak on podcasts, but also when I do a lot of LinkedIn content, it turns out that people aren't reading it. Surprise, people aren't reading my content and running up to my front office.
They're not.
Getting me a check. I mean, I can't believe it. Who knew? Yeah. No, it could come in a year later. So a podcast is an example of something that does both awareness and sort of gets people into your sort of personal funnel, whatever that may be. Also, what I've done is, in this context that has worked incredibly well, is do what I call give away your best stuff. Now, this is really hard for people to understand, but it taps into human nature. And if your book number 2 reference, aside from Geoffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm and Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rumelt, book number 3 recommendation is Robert Cialdini's The 6 Weapons of Influence, or the Psychology of Influence. And within the 6 weapons of influence, there's things like reciprocation, liking, scarcity, and so on. As a marketer in a startup environment, you must know the 6 weapons of influence. But there's 2 elements. One really important element of it is this idea of reciprocity. And reciprocity is where human nature automatically, if I, and the example being, Lucy, if I was in a bar with you, and I bought you a coffee or a drink or a cocktail, whatever it may be, you would feel obliged to then after that to go and say, Colin, do you want a coffee, tea, or a cocktail? There's just no 2 ways about it. That's in every single person in the world. Reciprocity from literally being a toddler onwards is built into our DNA. So reciprocity is very useful in what people call content marketing, which is, imagine you give away your best stuff. And this is what I do literally all the time. I will tell you all my secrets, everything you want to know about running a startup or brand strategy or go to market. I tell you my best stuff, and I tell you all the stuff I've done, warts and all. And this is how I teach people. And it is amazing, because what actually happens with this idea of giving away your best stuff is that people go, oh, right, I can now see what your business does. I can now see how you think. Okay, great. Therefore, you are a credible source. You're a credible professional source. I'm moving you from prospect into, I'm moving into where I'm interested. Process takes a while, but it's something that is not practiced enough because most people are too mean to give away their best material.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And this is that whole kind of concept of moving kind of from lead gen into demand gen, right? Is that, you know, if we create enough demand out there and get people to kind of trust you, then actually when they are ready to buy, you're the person that they're going to come to.
Which is where the issue of brand strategy comes in. So brand strategy, small b, brand strategy. The only sort of brand strategy you could have is to say, you should have, is like, when I create content, when I create a podcast, when I create a blog post, it's going to be beautifully designed. It's going to be incredibly professional. It's going to map to the sort of organization that we are and who our target market is. And, you know, if the target market likes, you know, you can guess that they're, you know, the colors green and blue are what they'll use the color green and blue. Yeah. Actually, that reminds me of something else, Lucy. So just on tactics and tactics in particular for startups. And I'm making a massive assumption, but let's just say many fintech startups are based out of the UK and based out of London. There is a thing that I do, just like I told you what I did about giving away the best material. The other thing I do is, and this is an exact thing we did, I must have done 4 or 5 times. I look at what the best practice is in terms of comms, go-to-market activation, as best as I can estimate it, for firms who are funded out of Silicon Valley by venture capitalists. So I'll go on to, say, the Andreessen Horowitz website. I'll find out who all the e-commerce B2B marketplace startups are, and I'll look at all their websites, okay? And particularly, obviously, the ones that are in my space. But I'll look at them and go, what's going on here? What is my reaction to these websites? What's my reaction to the copy that's being used? What's my reaction to the design? How does it make me feel, if you will? And from that, then I'm working through this idea of where their head was at and what can I borrow, be inspired by.
Repurpose is the
repurpose.
word.
I like that one. Yeah. So the line for you is, if you listen to it, is write the words copy, 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 or as writer Austin Kleon writes, steal like an artist. And I cannot emphasize this enough. Okay, if you're little old Colin or little old Lucy sitting in your office, crying into your metaphorical pint, going, I don't know what to do with this startup, I don't know where to go, that is the wrong way of thinking. You have all the inspiration in the world available to you on this thing called the internet. And you might go be too proud to say, I'm getting inspiration and repurposing from other people. That's bad idea. You might be saying, well, what if people catch me copying, and so on. That's all crapola. Yeah. Now, the reason you need to think about whether there's stuff you can be inspired by is very simple. Typically, there's just Lucy and Colin working in the startup, as I say, crying into the metaphorical pint every day, trying to work out what the hell is going on and how can we get product market fit. Whereas company X in Silicon Valley has $50 million worth of venture capital, 50 marketing staff, 100 sales staff, and they just might have thought through everything that you've been going through already. So I'll give you an example from yesterday morning. So working with a startup who does this very cool sustainability technology based on this crazy tech called nanobubbles. Now, nanobubbles are little tiny, tiny, tiny air bubbles in water that enable you to strip out pollution, to, you know, grow plants faster. It's really cool. The technology is known. If you use the word nanobubbles on the internet, you can find it. There's a company out of Silicon Valley. As we talked through his go-to-market strategy, I look on the web and there's the company there. And I said to the guy, his name was John, I said, John, have a look at this site. Tell me what's on this site. And he said, well, there's this. Okay, great. Is there anything you could get inspiration from here? And he was like, yeah, this bit here. Okay, great. Is there anything that you think is badly done? And he was like, this. Okay, I said, great. There you go. There's like a day's worth of thinking gone out the window. You now already know what the good and bad, the ugly is. But there was some very interesting point. His business does not target wastewater, but this company did. And I said, if you just look at how they're writing about wastewater, the visuals they're using and the tone and language that we're using there, it's kind of topical. It's very useful. It could be very much a top of funnel thing that you could use around PR. You could use as a Twitter strategy of content talking about, why this is an issue, or on LinkedIn. And you could bait people using that. And he was like, you're right. Yes, because talking about growing leafy vegetables is not really top of mind. But for PR purposes, wastewater is top of mind. And so there's things that you can do. That's why I say copy is a key strategy.
Reminds me, so there's another marketing hero that I have, aside from you, Colin. His name's Seth Godin.
Yeah.
Of course, a lot of people know. So he tells a story about being remarkable, and there's going to be a ton of my my team members or previous people that I've worked with that are going to be saying, "Oh God, here she goes again with her remarkable story." But he tells it really, really well, in that he basically says, there is no such thing as a USP anymore. Everybody is, looking and on the hunt for this kind of golden chalice, which is the USP. We've got to be unique. We've got to be different. And what Seth says is actually, we don't need to be different. We need to be, he uses this word, remarkable. And remarkable is great for two reasons. One, remarkable means fantastic, brilliant, you're remarkable, amazing. But the second most important part of that is the word remark in remarkable. It's about building conversation. It's about getting people to talk about you and your brand and what you're doing, creating conversation. That's what's going to bring the audience back to you at the end of the day. So that's what he says. He says, don't worry about kind of trying to find something different or, whatever your USP, just do it bigger and better and more remarkable than anybody else.
Well, there's remind me, because that actually thank you for reminding me, because that reminds me of 2 points around tactics. Okay, we'll call this PR as a tactic, if you will, and so this is a funny one. Okay, let's say our team here listening to the call is working with a chief exec, and typically, if you're chief exec, you've got to have a little element of ego around you, or at least possibly an element of self-confidence that is slightly different to the rest of the world. One of the things we want to do is use that and harness that as a vehicle to get this remarkability, as in to get people to notice. And I used to call this like get them to speak at the opening of an envelope. Or if you're a politician, you might have heard the phrase, if you know anything about politics, you might have heard of this phrase called working the stump, or pressing the flesh and kissing the babies. And this idea of doing that and making your chief exec or a person in the organization as a mouthpiece for the business is always the correct strategy. It's just that it can be hard to convince the boss of that, okay? Because talking doesn't sound like a marketing strategy, but it is. Now, there's numerous examples, but I'll use them from the startup world and I'll use them from the airline world. So the example, and everybody on this call, there's a couple of things I can guarantee. Everybody on this call is obviously incredibly scintillated by the conversation that we're having. And the second thing they know is they know Michael O'Leary. And he is the chief exec of a company called Ryanair, low-cost carrier in Europe. And their 100% strategy all the time is to gain coverage and not to spend their money on advertising. And it's a couple of years ago when I was working in the airline business, I asked my media agency to do an analysis of the spend of EasyJet, their competitor in the UK, versus Ryanair. EasyJet were spending £22 million a year at the time on advertising, and Ryanair was spending £7 million at the time on advertising in the UK only. That gap is made up by Michael O'Leary. And so that idea, the 7 million to 22 million pound, is actually one that is an idea that's always been used in Silicon Valley. So all that publicity you see about that crazy guy who's the head of WeWork, all that publicity you see for what's his name, Travis Kalanick from Uber, that is a series of people sitting in a room who are comms people going, how can I get my guy or gal to speak at the opening of an envelope. Like even the whole Theranos debacle, that was essentially somebody went and said, we've got somebody blonde, somebody attractive, good looking, who's articulate, and they turn the person into a sort of commodity that they can sell through communication channels. And this sounds a bit strange, but this is exactly what people are doing all the time. And in a startup environment, that is your fastest way to get, inverted commas, brand awareness. And of course, then you have to have, as Wes Cow calls it, a spiky point of view. You have to have a point of view that is not like, Lucy, what do you think about X? Oh, I agree. But there's no news in I agree. Yeah, you have to have a spiky point of view. For instance, I'm now about to make this next section up, so don't quote me on it. B2B fintech startups are the greatest place in the UK to work. Here's why. Yeah, so there's a tactic around working. Yeah. The B2B fintech business in the UK is been left behind by the government, and even though it's the biggest possible opportunity for innovative thinking, innovative products, and jobs in the future. Okay, now you've nothing to back that up, but you've made a big claim. Yeah, a spiky point of view. So use as a tactic, use your chief exec or a mouthpiece in the organization to speak at the opening of an envelope. They have to have 2 or 3 shticks, as they say in New York. My shtick being a controversial thing around the industry, and a controversial thing around products within the industry or practices within the industry.
This is really interesting. So I mean, this is where a lot of marketplaces, the idea for marketplaces have spun up from, right? Because there's a gap in there where pieces of the market are not being solved. So you have the sellers and buyers that are coming together, maybe offline somewhere, and not in the kind of the kind of the commerce world. And that's what marketplaces do, right? They kind of bring these two buyers and sellers together, and it's really interesting, some of the different sort of marketplaces that we've seen, like the ideas for them spinning up.
Well, there's actually just on marketplaces. Well, before I get into the detail marketplaces, just on that point around the chief exec becoming a mouthpiece, or another person becoming a mouthpiece, there's 2 elements to it. One is the practical element of it. Is the metaphor I want to use is a comedian, and I don't mean they are to be a comedian. I mean how a comedian thinks about their act. There was a Chris Rock, the big American comedian, show a few years ago, and they had the show live from, not live, but they had a version of the show from London and I think Johannesburg, and they showed the 2 shows side by side, and every single word and every single act that he said was identical down to the second. Yeah, and it looks as though it's all ad-libbed, but the whole thing is rehearsed within an inch of his life. And that idea of saying the same thing all the time and not doing it, it's an Alistair Campbell idea from the guy who used to be the head of comms for Tony Blair's government. He said, just when you're sick of saying something, you just might have reached the outer edge of public opinion. So when you're sending your chief exec out on the road, Lucy, I'm sending you out on the road, and here's what you have to say. And if you say anything else, I will be very upset. You say the same 2 or 3 things till you're completely sick of saying it. And then eventually you might reach the outer edge of your particular target market's opinion. So they only ever say the same thing. Yeah.
I say this to my team all the time. So I think because we live and breathe in our job every day, kind of what we're doing, we do get a little bit bored of it, and quite quickly it's like, no, we need to do something different. But it's not just repeat.
Repeat. Nobody cares about your job as much as you do. Yeah. So the comedian kind of frame of reference there, which is I say the same thing all the time. Where am I now? So the PR thing is the key thing. Also, by the way, a smart tactic is if you're writing a piece of content, or maybe video content, or it's a speech at a conference, that of course is the same thing as the same thing the chief exec is saying all the time. You never have really more than 3 or 4 messages out there. One thing I do, by the way, as well is, and I actively do this, is let's say we're going after one particular type of a spiky point of view, or we're doing something that's giving away our best material. I would go to write a really, really long nth degree detail. So I was trying to do a business, trying to work with a brand new product, and the product was, we called it T-data. We called it kind of a big data thing about 5 years ago. And really what we were doing was trying to develop a really deep analytical tool that would be able to look at 500 million pieces of data and create, prescriptive, descriptive, and propensity models. I wasn't that familiar with all this stuff, to be honest with you. So I actually forced myself every evening, excuse me, to write a very long white paper on it so I could understand it. And that ended up being, I think, 6,000 words. But that initial hard work that, brought a tear to my eye every night, ended up being then parsed out forever. As in, I wrote it in, say, 4 chapters of 1,000 words, or 5 chapters of 1,000 words. And that 1,000 words were then rinsed, repeated, recycled for speeches, website content, PR content, video content. So what I want you to do, particularly as we're talking about startups here, is make a punt on some deep, wide content at the start, and then use that for a while, knowing that you may, as we said earlier on, we may jettison very fast. Actually, you mentioned a point there, Lucy. I didn't get into the detail enough, but B2B marketplaces. A couple of quick points here. So most people, e-commerce marketplaces or fintech related, most people, including journalists and people like average people, don't realize how big marketplaces are. And in the world of B2C marketplaces, e-commerce is marketplaces are 2/3 of all e-commerce in the world. Secondly, people don't really understand e-commerce in the B2B context. So there's 2 elements already you can talk about, which is, marketplaces are actually what e-commerce really is. Yeah. They don't realize the scale of Alibaba, which is the biggest e-commerce business in the world. The second thing I would also say is to draw inspiration from is Andreessen Horowitz. If you just search a16z.com, it'll come. And they have a top 100 marketplaces in the world, top 100 fast-growing marketplaces in the world. And there's some very interesting firms there.
Brilliant. That's fantastic. I just realized we probably need to think about kind of wrapping this up. Colin, this always happens. I could talk to you forever. It's really, really interesting. We've covered a huge amount of ground today in this episode, and I hope everybody has taken something at least away from it. I've certainly taken quite a lot away from it. So thank you so much for taking part in this discussion. If you enjoyed today's episode, then as we mentioned, you might have heard, Colin is going to be coming back to actually do another episode of us. And I love the point that you made about building out the big, white paper and then kind of unpacking it, because we're going to be talking about content strategy and using that to kind of drive sales and build a brand. So yeah, please come back and listen to the second episode, which is going to be as insightful. So thank you very much, Colin, and I hope to see everybody on the next episode.
No, thank you for your time, Lucy. I hope everybody on the podcast enjoyed and got something from it. I'll see you guys soon.
Thank you.